All of these topics are amenable to this kind of openness. With the exception of the Gellius classic, none of these require classical or canonical texts, though for the most part, they are part of what we read. This also means that we can look beyond to other times and places for readings, provided that they are in Latin. These are all topics that I'm interested in, but they're not topics I'm expert in. I cannot be the center of knowledge in these classes because that would just be misrepresenting myself to my students. What I can be is a map maker and an experienced guide to the Latin language, but I'm going to need their knowledge in order to make it a useful class. All of these topics require some kind of theoretical apparatus beyond classics so that we can put what we learn into context. I choose the text that will frame our conversation early on, but this is a place where those class visitors, colleagues, and eventually the students themselves will start to build a series of readings for all of us based on their own knowledge and interests. And finally, all these topics lend themselves to critical self-reflection. All allow them to use the worlds described in the Latin texts as test cases against which they can set their own experience. At times they draw inspiration from them, critique them, contextualize them, disavow them. Always they give them a chance to reflect on the application of what they have learned in their own lives. So I look at Rendon's list of what we tend to privilege, and I consider how reshaping Latin classes in this way has a potential to disrupt those standard agreements that she talks about. And I am not saying that these agreements could not be disrupted with that standard menu of language classes, but I'm saying that for me, I find it easier to do this when I approach Latin courses via topics instead of author. In addition, if the composition of my class varies widely from year to year, which of course it always does, topics give me a lot more to work with in terms of scaffolding texts to work toward greater proficiency for all students. So how does this work? My test case for you is a course that I have taught twice, including last spring when we were given 10 days to shift our spring quarter to an exclusively online environment. The fairy tales class is one that has pretty much no barrier to entry. I've had students from all backgrounds, including international students, but all are able to discuss fantastical stories that they loved hearing or reading as small children. And all of them have been familiar, for better or for worse, with Disney versions of all of the princess movies. Their own experience with these kinds of stories is not just a great class resource, but it is almost always something that they have strong feelings about. They love the stories, they hate the misogyny, they delight in scaring themselves, or they read them to their younger siblings. These stories are ways to share themselves from the beginning and a way to show from the start why it might be useful to ask questions about something that elicits such strong emotions. We ground our reading in Marina Warner's Once Upon a Time, which is a substantive and highly readable text, but one designed for a lay audience. And there's enough in there to get us going. And of course, we read Latin. We begin with some of Aesop's fables and we move on to 2 or 3 of Grimm's tales, which have been translated into Latin. The fables are short and the narration straightforward. We preview the Grimm's stories before reading, but in my experience in these 2 iterations, so far, all those stories have been familiar to my students. Again, these are longer tales than the fables, but also the Latinity is very straightforward and the vocabulary pretty common and repetitive. Moreover, it teaches them clearly the structure of the fairy tale, including tropes and vocabulary that we should be watching for. We're now ready to move into what we might call authentic Latin, where the 2 texts I choose are marginally canonical at best. The Cupid and Psyche section of Apuleius's Metamorphoses has the hallmarks of a fairy tale right down to its vocabulary. We read as much of this as is feasible until the last 2 weeks of the term, where we finish with the relatively obscure Joseph and Asenath, which I project here for you from its manuscript from the critical edition. I confess I only learned about this tale relatively recently, and although I may be the only person teaching this text, I can't recommend it more highly. It is much less challenging than the Apuleius, and my placement of it after rather than before is by design. In our 10-week term, by the 8th week, my students are really exhausted, and using this text as our dessert both gives them time to do other kind of cognitive work and to see how much fluency they have built over the past 8 weeks. The text itself is a love story of the biblical Joseph and an Egyptian princess, Asenath or Asenech. And it follows a princess in the tower storyline with a little bit of early Christian flavor thrown in. In terms of content, this story also has some unanticipated virtues. It is set in North Africa. It has a prominent female protagonist, and its subject focuses on cultural and religious difference. The Latin, as perhaps you can see, is pretty straightforward. And at this point, it's really refreshing for them. They can almost read it unaided. For the purposes of the class, it contains the familiar tropes of the fairy tale. And by this point in the class, the students are easily able to identify them and draw connections between them and the Grimm tales. Better still, look at this text. Which side are we even to read? This has to be our first conversation, but it's also a visual reminder about the mutability of fairy tales. Since there's no commentary, and for the most part it doesn't require one, I had students last term use hypothesis to annotate and create a kind of collaborative commentary together. The fact that the text is obscure, not canonical, not classical, and I suppose some might say not very good or interesting, actually allowed for more collaborative final reading. And because the text Latin was not hard, it gave us time to engage in critical reflection about the role of fantasy stories for children and for adults, their ongoing appeal, and why we continue to read them, including last spring, several reflections about reading fantasy in a time of pandemic. So, of course, Latin classes for improving our ability to read, write, speak, think with the Latin language. And if I did not ground my work in that, I would be doing my students a disservice. Yet in the past 5 years, we've had 2 students go on to become Latin teachers and 1 move on to graduate school. The rest are all doing work elsewhere, in medical school, as an elementary school teacher, as a baker, in human resources, and well beyond. I expect these students are not, former students, are not curling up with a mug of tea and De Rerum Natura on a cold winter's night. But I'm hoping that the courses that I choose to teach, as they are increasingly modeled on an inclusive pedagogy like Rendon's, broadens our notion of what counts as acceptable material for study and allows students and teachers to be more fully present themselves. Texts like Joseph and Asenath showcase gender, ethnic, and religious diversity, which is great. Yet they allow me to center inclusiveness in other ways, by incorporating me as a learner alongside my students, by offering them opportunities to collaborate in knowledge building, by encouraging error and revision in the absence of a fixed authority on the text or a fixed text, and by allowing multiple openings for students to engage with the text as fairy tale, whether from their own religious background, through the protagonist or familiar storytelling traditions, as an exemplum of a rich fairy tale tradition that they now know a good deal about, or in some other way that I can't even anticipate. For me, texts like this give me more ways to support student access and engagement while still fostering their language acquisition. Thanks.